Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. With the indulgence of the audience, I'd like to begin my presentation this afternoon with the personal account of the road I travelled to be here with you today. In some ways, it's a personal story, but in other ways, it's more than a personal story, it's a shared story, and I hope the things I say now will resonate with other people in the audience. In 2005, I attended a modest yet well-organised and exciting conference at the University of Western Australia. It was focused on non-human animals. I learnt of the conference only after the call for papers had closed. Nonetheless, at considerable expense, I travelled to Perth and I participated in the conference because as a PhD student and aspiring academic interested in non-human animals, I'd been searching for opportunities to discuss my research with like-minded scholars. I'm very glad I attended that conference. Now, I've not been invited here in my capacity as the AASG's unofficial historian. But my point in remembering all of this is that I think it's worthwhile taking a moment to reflect on how far we've come. When I applied to undertake my PhD at this very institution, I was advised in writing that the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney could not provide supervision to someone interested in animals, but that if I wished to explore animal-related questions, I should apply to philosophy. At that time, it was only philosophers who were permitted to ask non-invasive questions concerning non-human animals. How things have changed. It is therefore a double pleasure to be invited to address this conference today. It's lovely because I feel that I've been part of a long journey and that I've shared that journey with many other human-animal studies scholars in this country and in this room. So while it's undoubtedly true that human-animal scholarship has gone from strength to strength, both in Australia and around the world, it's also true that political scientists have been slow to come to the party. Why might that be? The study of politics is the study of power relations in complex societies. Perhaps unsurprisingly, because humans construct political institutions and do so in order to manage our power relations among ourselves, particularly in relation to valued and finite resources, those who study power relations tend to be interested in humans and humans only. More and more journal articles are starting to be published by political scholars trying to make sense of what our political institutions mean to non-human animals. Indeed, while we remain a small community of political scholars interested in non-human animals, commentators are starting to identify schools of thought within political scholarship in this field. Those who do so tend to place Garner and Cochrane on one side and Kimlicker and me on the other. According to this analysis, Garner and Cochrane are interested in more universal values that might apply to animals in general, whereas Kimlicker and I are more interested in what we owe to animals by virtue of the fact that some animals have joined us here in contemporary political society. To borrow the language of the contract theorist, in my view, some animals have been contracted in, and it is precisely because they've been contracted in that we owe them some of the benefits that we claim are associated with a life lived within a liberal democracy. Let's call those animals who've joined us here in modern political society captive animals. Those animals are captive in as much as they've either been bred to live easily among us or they are literally under human domination, either by means of a cage, tethers, or some other type of dependency relationship. Captive animals are the smaller proportion of non-human animals who live on Earth, but they're by no means insignificant. Many billions of animals are purposely bred and then killed for food every year. Every aspect of their lives, from how they're bred, to where they're housed, to what they're fed, their access to veterinary care, their access to exercise, the manner in which they're transported, and eventually the manner in which they die, is the subject of legislation. In my view, those animals are part of the liberal democratic landscape. The laws we create to regulate their lives are created using all the same mechanisms we use to create other liberal democratic laws. And in my view, there's no reason why those laws should not reflect liberal democratic values, both in the way in which they are formulated and the interest they bestow bestow upon the subjects of that legislation. Animal welfare law in Australia, in the UK, in America, throughout Europe is terribly inconsistent. So the rabbit is a classic example that really clearly demonstrates this inconsistency. So a rabbit can be a companion animal living in someone's backyard. A rabbit can be used in research, of course. A rabbit can be used for agricultural purposes, either for meat or for fur farming. An animal can be an exhibited animal, so in a petting zoo for little children to molest. Or an animal can be a free-living animal, depending on what context they're in or what other interests are at play. They'll either be deemed to be a native animal and therefore people like them, or a pest species, like we say in Australia, and then people want to see them dead. So the law is inconsistent. And that inconsistency it influences how we create the law. So there is no law in Australia, in the UK, throughout the European Union called the Law for the Protection of Rabbits, and there's no law that exists only to think about what it is that a rabbit benefits from and what kind of protections we should afford rabbits if we want rabbits to have a good life. Instead, the way we create laws for animals is dependent entirely on how we want to make use of them. So it's a very, very instrumental way of creating legal protection for animals. In my book, Animals, Equality and Democracy, I spend a lot of time describing which animals are treated better and which animals are treated worse before the law. In short, the internal inconsistency means that if you are going to come into this world as a non-human animal, it's always better to be born non-economically productive. Make sure no one's trying to make money out of you. It's also better to be seen. You don't want to be born an animal and find yourself in a situation where the only person who can see you is your owner. This is especially true if your owner is trying to make money out of you. Make sure others who don't have a pecuniary interest in your life can see you and make an independent assessment of how you're faring. And finally, if you can manage it, make sure you're born of a charismatic species. Even in the non-human world, looks count. Whatever you do, don't forget the old adage, it pays to be popular. I really love to use this image when I start to talk about this issue of animals and visibility. And for me, what this image does is it captures in very, very stark terms the inherently invisible nature of many non-human animals in our society. Now, it is true that we can all see some animals. Many people have companion animals. We can see birds in the sky. We might see possums here and there. But we purposely breed very, very large numbers of animals, particularly for the agricultural sector. For example, there are 3 times more agricultural animals alive on planet Earth today than there are humans. And these vast numbers of animals are living among us, but they're living in a way that's socially invisible. And that's because they predominantly live within factory farms. We've landed at this point where we breed these abundant numbers of animals and we have them living in these places that are socially invisible and socially exclusive. So you do not incidentally see, for example, broiler hens, who are the hens that become meat, chicken meat, just as part of your normal life. And not only do you not happen to see them as part of your normal life, you actually cannot see them even if you have a real interest. And that's why I love Yvette Watt's picture, because what you can see here is gate after gate, do not trespass sign after do not trespass sign. She took all these photos from publicly accessible land, but she was never able to get close to the animals. And living inside those sheds are many hundreds of thousands of animals that simply cannot be seen, except by the people who own them and who make money out of them. So for me, this sets up a really fascinating puzzle. And it's a profound puzzle that's really been at the heart of my scholarship for the past 15 to 20 years. We live in a liberal democracy. Liberal democracies, by their very nature, are political systems where the community are involved in developing policy. But the challenge we have is, how can we decide who to vote for or what kind of animal welfare policy to support if we can't actually see the animals who are at the heart of that animal welfare policy? How do we know if the policies or the laws we make to govern the lives of animals are appropriate or not? So this is the puzzle. We have all these many hundreds of thousands, billions of animals that we can't see. We have laws that are made in our name to regulate their lives, to protect their interests, and we're not allowed to see the animals, we're not allowed to see those laws in action. Here is a photo of commercial egg-laying hens in Australia that in all likelihood was obtained illegally. I find this photo much more informative from a public policy perspective. Looking at this photo, I think to myself, it appears the hens don't have adequate space to move. It appears the hens are caged in close confinement. It appears the hens don't have access to grass or sunlight. It appears the hens are unable to make nests. It appears the hens don't have access to fresh food. It appears the hens have suffered from feather loss. Looking at this photo, I think to myself, if these are legally housed birds, then policy in this area doesn't reflect my values, and I'd like to see it changed. So where did this image come from? In all likelihood, it was obtained by an animal activist who trespassed into the shed in order to capture the image. In other words, in order to provide the community with some level of insight into how commercial egg-laying hens live, someone had to break the law, and in doing so, risk their own liberty to capture this image for distribution. I put it to you that without people willing to do such things, none of us would have any idea what a battery cage looks like, and that would be the most serious of Liberal democratic failings. In work I've undertaken with Claire McCausland and Scott Brenton, I've argued that animal activists who trespass in order to capture images of non-human animals for the explicit purpose of generating policy debate are acting in a manner that's consistent with the best tradition of civil disobedience. The problem of transparency is difficult to address. I cannot see a situation in which private property relations will break down and interested parties will be able to walk onto anybody's property in order to inspect their animals. So what's the solution? I propose that people who are interested in protecting the interests of non-human animals seek to engage the fundamental Liberal democratic principle of equity and apply the equity principle to the way we create public policy for animals. Engaging the equity principle would also make our animal welfare laws decidedly more Liberal democratic than they currently are. It would also mean that non-human animals would finally share in some of the benefits of a life in a Liberal democracy. I myself have tried to increase the visibility of animals by getting them into the news, by getting them into the public discourse, by inserting them into community conversations. So I've had pieces in the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age, the Guardian. I've had pieces in ABC The Drum, New Matilda, The Conversation. You know, I've had them in a lot of different places, and then it's not just accidental. While I write, I'm thinking to myself, what kind of a publication is this? What kind of issues might they be interested in? What kind of issues are they talking about? In addition to writing opinion pieces, I also do at times appear in the news media, and that's usually speaking as an expert on animal issues within the context of perhaps a news item. So if something is happening in the news, an elephant breaks out of a zoo, or, you know, the last lion is shot, God forbid, or a case of animal cruelty is exposed, I might well be called upon to say a few words about that issue to camera. And it's nerve-wracking and it can be a bit stressful, but I do think that, again, speaking about animal issues so we are more aware of how animals live and die is important, and I do take that responsibility seriously. As you well know, people are generating their own media these days. Very few people are relying on the kind of old media, which brings me to my real passion, which is podcasting. So I've got my own podcast. It's called Knowing Animals. I've been making it for 5 years. And what it is a regular podcast in which I interview an animal studies scholar or an animal advocate about their work for animals. It is a really great way, in my view, to bring animals out into the community, to get conversations going, to publicise ideas. It's accessible, and now, I'll be off at a cafe chatting to someone and the conversation will turn to podcasts. What's a good podcast you listen to? But they're also specialists, so they're a way to talk about these specialist topics such as animals and the lives of animals that you wouldn't get in mainstream media. So you can, get these really niche conversations going, and they're also a wonderful creative outlet. So in my case, I want to talk about animals. I want the community to know how animals are living and dying, and I want people to know about these wonderful ideas that animal advocates and animal studies scholars are having about the lives of animals, including how to protect them. I am Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. See ya.